Happy Monday. I'm going to warn you, this A block, sometimes the show has evolved to the point where sometimes I do a long A block and it has like a big arc and it lands with an exclamation point. This is one of those A blocks. This is one of those things that you have not been otherwise hearing about in the news, but stick with me. This is worth it. Check this out. Okay. Let's say you are a thief. You've stolen a bunch of money. Or maybe you're a crook and you have obtained a bunch of money through illegal means, through drug dealing or fraud or prostitution or something. Or, let's be very discreet about it. Let's say you have somehow amassed a large amount of money and you just don't want to talk about where it came from. In any of these hypothetical circumstances, I want you to imagine, though, that you're not some podunk, thief, crook, shady bastard. You're big time. So you've got these ill-gotten gains, and it's not like a briefcase full of money. We're talking millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars that you have amassed through, let's not talk about it, means. If you want to ever be able to actually use that money and enjoy that money, you can't move it around just in bags full of loot. Once you're talking about millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars, there aren't enough briefcases and duffel bags in the world for you to move that kind of money around easily. And if you want to buy big rich guy stuff, if you want to buy a private island or a fleet of Ferraris or something, if you show up to pay with hay bales full of $20 bills, somebody's going to notice that. Somebody's going to start asking questions. And if you decide to deposit all your money in a bank, they're going to want to know where that came from in most banks, under most laws, in most countries. So if you've made lots and lots and lots of money in some shady way, you need something to do with that money that makes the money look sort of legit, just so you can use it. And we often think of that process of making illegal or shady or secret money look legitimate. We often think of that as like a mob thing, right? Like an organized crime thing, money laundering. But money laundering can also be a bank thing if you know the right kind of bank to go to. A couple of weeks ago, the big German bank Deutsche Bank, they got fined $630 million for money laundering. Apparently, Deutsche Bank moved roughly $10 billion out of Russia and disguised the source of those funds, made it all look legit. It was all tied to some big Russian stock fraud scheme or something. But it's funny, some of the accounts that were involved in that $10 billion money laundering scheme, some of those accounts were personally held by relatives of Vladimir Putin and by some of Vladimir Putin's closest and oldest friends. And when this money laundering scheme, including their accounts, was exposed at Deutsche Bank, Russian authorities, the Russian central bank, decided they needed to look into this. They were very concerned about this scheme to siphon money out of Russia without anybody knowing where it came from. The Russian central bank looked into the scheme and they decided to fine Deutsche Bank $5,000. Let me mention again here that the fraud here, the money laundering scheme here, was $10 billion. But that's how much the Russian central bank levied against them as a fine. Luckily, though, this was not just a Russia thing. This scheme did involve a Deutsche Bank office, yes, in Moscow, but also in New York, and interestingly, also in Cyprus. Stick a pin in that for a second. We will come back to Cyprus. Because of the New York connection, this giant multi-billion-dollar money laundering scheme ended up in the crosshairs of the Obama Justice Department. And yeah, when the Russians looked into it, they may have decided to only fine Deutsche Bank $5,000. When Loretta Lynch and the Obama Justice Department looked into it, they ended up fining Deutsche Bank $630 million. Needless to say, they took it slightly more seriously than the Russians did. For the people at the top when these things happen, though, it always seems to be sort of a soft landing, doesn't it? I said the offices involved in this Russian money laundering scheme were in Moscow and New York and Cyprus. When the last chairman of Deutsche Bank needed a new job after Deutsche Bank, where he landed was, very softly, as the chairman of the Bank of Cyprus. And Cyprus is a lovely place and a lovely part of the world, has a lot going for it. But in global finance, Cyprus is basically the locking black briefcase into which Russian oligarchs stuffed their ill-gotten gains before they handcuffed that briefcase to a henchman somewhere. This is where Russian oligarchs launder their money. And so Deutsche Bank takes part in this huge scam to launder Russian money, to basically smuggle billions of dollars out of Russia through its offices in Moscow and New York and Cyprus. The bank chairman from Deutsche Bank then personally lands at a bank in Cyprus. He was appointed chairman of that bank by its two largest shareholders. One of the two largest shareholders of that Bank of Cyprus is a close personal friend and business associate of Russian President Vladimir Putin. One of the other major investors in that bank, this is where it gets good, is a Russian oligarch who they call the King of Fertilizer. I know some of my critics call me the Queen of Fertilizer, but they mean it differently. But the King of Fertilizer guy, that is where the news comes home tonight. For Americans who are trying to make sense of our new president and this new government that he's putting in place, and what really explains their behavior when other political norms don't seem to. Because the King of Fertilizer is just an amazing story. He's not the richest person in Russia. That would probably be Vladimir Putin. But he does hold the title for what is believed to be the most expensive divorce in modern history. As part of his divorce proceedings, at one point, a Swiss bank awarded his wife $4.5 billion as her divorce settlement. Wow. You know, and a couple's divorce would usually be a private matter, especially one involving people we don't know from other countries. Why do we care? The reason it turns out we all have to care about it, the reason we all have to know about it now, is because it's becoming part of what we need to understand about our current American presidency. The split up of this couple reportedly started in 2007, 2008, thereabouts. The divorce settlement, in the end, wasn't finalized until 2015. But it was very, very lurid. The 7-year, 8-year period of that divorce, it was in the papers all the time. It was international news, had all these tabloid aspects to it. At one point, she accused him of having orgies on his yacht with young girls, and he accused her of stealing jewelry. He, in fact, had her arrested as a jewel thief at some point. Mostly what they fought about, though, was dividing their money. She thought that she was entitled to a multi-billion-dollar settlement in the divorce. And, this is important, she accused him of hiding his money so she couldn't get access to it. She accused him specifically of, quote, secreting and transferring assets in order to avoid his obligations. She basically said in order to keep her from getting her hands on what she believed was his money, he started putting his money in places she couldn't get to it. He started putting his money in very large chunks, in the largest chunks he could, into trusts in foreign countries, trusts that own stuff or held assets, anything to get his money off his balance sheet so she couldn't get it in the divorce. And that's a thing that happens in ugly divorces the world over. But when you're the King of Fertilizer, when that happens in your divorce, it makes the Today Show.
This is 15 Central Park West in New York City. It's one of the most exclusive addresses and home of the most expensive condo. As you mentioned, with so many struggling to pay rents and mortgages, a college student just bought it, and it will not even be her primary residence. It's a sweeping view that's breathtaking and record-breaking. For the new young owner, it's just a part-time pad. The 10-room penthouse graced the cover of Architectural Digest magazine just last year. It sits atop what's considered the most expensive building in all of New York. Outside, a wraparound terrace overlooking Central Park. Inside, guests can tour the private library, but those guests could be college students. That's because, according to Forbes magazine, the new owner is the 22-year-old daughter of a Russian billionaire. Ekaterina Rybolovlev is studying at an undisclosed college in America, but she's a resident of Monaco. Price tag for her new part-time place, $88 million, all paid for by Daddy.
The trend right now is you're seeing a lot of money come from overseas to purchase these super high-end properties. It's a great investment for them, and a lot of people think that it's safer than the stock market.
In 2008, Ekaterina's father, Dmitry Rybolovlev, also bought this 33,000-square-foot Florida estate from Donald Trump. He paid the Donald $95 million in cash. He may reportedly lose it, though, in an ugly divorce battle that could cost him half his worth. But the New York penthouse should be safe. It's in Ekaterina's name.
Again, this is a divorce that went through 6 different venues, 6 different courts. At one point, there was a $4.5 billion judgment for the wife. $4.5 billion. She accused her husband of parking all his money in overseas trusts that held very expensive assets, so she couldn't get access to more of his money. And those trusts did things like hold very, very, very expensive real estate all over the world. The Greek island where Jackie Kennedy married Aristotle Onassis, I think it's called Scorpios, he bought that island for $150 million. The actor Will Smith had a nice house in Hawaii. He bought that for $20 million. This guy apparently has an adjoining compound of properties in the Swiss Alps that he bought for $135 million. And locking up your money in assets like this, specifically to shield them from your ex-wife, who you hate, right, it's probably kind of a fun way to stick it to your spouse and avoid the accountants and the courts, right? But it also creates, if you think about it, this incredible opportunity for anybody who's in a position to sell something really, really, really expensive. Because this guy's motivation is not to get a good deal on any of these things, right? This guy is trying to park as much of his Russian money somewhere else. As much of his money as he can, he needs it tied up in real estate and these big assets in other countries. The bigger the deal, the bigger the price tag, the better. I mean, you want to be the guy who owns the Greek private island when the king of fertilizer starts looking for islands to buy to shelter his money from his wife. Right? You want to be the real estate broker in New York City who's looking to sell the single most expensive private apartment in New York City when that guy comes around looking to spend as much money as he possibly can. The more money, the better. I mean, for the right kind of person, for the right kind of seller, this guy, the king of fertilizer, Dmitry Ryobolov, he's just a walking cash register if you have the right kind of thing to sell him. Behold. La Maison de l'Amitié. My only thing worse than my Russian pronunciation is my French pronunciation. But La Maison de l'Amitié, it means the house of friendship, house of amity. Remember the Amityville Horror? The House of Amity, this house, was built in 2001 by a zillionaire, American zillionaire, who moved from New England down to Palm Beach, Florida, but then, sadly, he promptly went bankrupt. While he was still Richie Rich, before he went bankrupt, he did build this astounding house. It is tens of thousands of square feet. It has 22 bathrooms. Think about that. 22 people can go all at the same time. Although, watch out if they all flush at the same time. Kaboom! This zillionaire guy built this incredibly gaudy, gigantic mansion in Palm Beach, Florida in 2001. By 2004, it had been seized by the bankruptcy court, and he and his wife were on their way to facing tax evasion charges. But this house was put up on auction in conjunction with the bankruptcy in 2004. The person who bought the house on auction is now President Donald Trump. He bought it for $40 million. And then that big house in Palm Beach, it sat empty for 2 years. And it became sort of this local legend in Palm Beach real estate because the house was thought of as, locally, it was thought of as kind of a monstrosity. It was frequently described as gauche, as rococo. It had like fake art everywhere, you know, art inspired by real painters, which is sort of copies of stuff painted on the walls. Parts of the interior of the house were cobblestone, which nobody could quite explain. It also reportedly had a terrible mold problem. But Donald Trump bought it for $40 million in 2006. It sat empty for 2 years. And then in 2008, along comes Dmitry Ryobolov, the king of fertilizer, right? Going through the mother of all divorces, needing the biggest ticket items you could possibly imagine as ways to shelter his money from his darn wife. The bigger the price tag, the better. I'm buying Greek islands. I'm buying the most expensive apartments in New York City. I need places to put my money. And Dmitry Ryobolov turns around in 2008 and pays Donald Trump $100 million for that house. 2.5 times what Trump had bought it for 2 years earlier. Why did this guy spend $100 million on that property? I don't know. We do know that he never moved in. In fact, some reporting on the sale indicates that he never once set foot in it, and it's now being torn down. Trump and Ryobolov have commented publicly that they never dealt with each other directly throughout the whole period of that sale. They never met. They only worked through intermediaries, which is interesting for a financial transaction that big, right? That was the single highest price paid for a single American house at the time of that transaction. That record actually may still hold. That may be the single most expensive house transaction ever in the United States. They never met. They only went through intermediaries. Who were the intermediaries? Well, the king of fertilizer, Dmitry Ryabov, who basically popped $60 million neatly into Donald Trump's pocket in this transaction. He doesn't have much of an American profile, but he does have one very important American connection. Remember I said that he's one of the major shareholders in that Bank of Cyprus? The chairman of that bank, as I said, is the former chairman of Deutsche Bank, which just paid a $630 million fine for laundering illegal Russian money. He was installed as chairman at the Bank of Cyprus by the two vice chairmen of that bank. One of the vice chairmen of that bank is, as I mentioned, Vladimir Putin's close associate. But the other vice chairman of that bank is an American. The American is, in fact, the single largest shareholder in that bank. That bank that includes the guy whose firm was just done for the Russian money laundering and Vladimir Putin's very close associate. I should tell you, the vice chairman who that guy replaced was not only also a close Vladimir Putin associate, he was a guy who Putin was in the KGB with before he became Vladimir Putin. This bank is also owned in part by the Russian king of fertilizer, who did this inexplicable deal that Donald Trump miraculously stumbled into, that netted him $60 million for doing basically nothing. There is one American who is in the middle of that bank, who is the single largest shareholder in that bank. There's one American in that bank. And tonight, that American was just confirmed as our nation's new Secretary of Commerce. His name is Wilbur Ross. He's an American businessman, longtime friend of Donald Trump. Not much experience in international banking, but inexplicably ended up the majority shareholder in a Cypriot bank with all sorts of ties to Vladimir Putin and to a Russian oligarch who somehow, through some intermediary, we don't know who, ended up stuffing $60 million into Donald Trump's wallet, paying him $100 million for something that Trump had just bought for $40 million, and that the oligarch apparently had no personal interest in whatsoever. He never even bothered living in it and maybe never even visited. But Trump and that oligarch, no questions asked. They never met. No connection whatsoever, except through Wilbur Ross, Donald Trump's old friend, who will be sworn into the cabinet tomorrow as Commerce Secretary. And there's basically two things to know about this story going forward. One, in terms of explaining this presidency. The other one, in terms of what happens next in our politics. In terms of explaining this presidency, you should know that at the time this magical deal emerged out of nowhere that put tens of millions of dollars in Donald Trump's pocket, at that time, Donald Trump was financially having a very difficult time. It is a matter of public record that he was fighting very hard, among other things, to avoid paying off a big loan that he had with Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank needs the money. That means Trump needs the money. That means Trump needs to get the money. So this mysterious windfall infusion of cash from the Russian guy came at just the right time for now President Trump. Every investigative reporter in the country right now is trying to figure out whether there is some reason that our new president appears to feel so beholden to Russia and to Vladimir Putin. Well, this part here, this is not just like a loose thread. This is like a rope ladder hanging down from the ceiling, begging people to crawl up this and look around. So that's one thing to know about this story. The other thing to know about this story has to do with what's going to happen next in the administration. We're going to talk later on this hour about what's happening with the investigation or lack thereof into Trump and his Russia ties. But meanwhile, he is slowly, hercules-jerkily staffing up his administration. This weekend, his nominee to be Secretary of the Navy dropped out. That follows a similar decision by his nominee to be Secretary of the Army, who also dropped out. That follows the firing of his national security advisor, and then his next two picks to be national security advisor reportedly turning him down. We also learned this weekend that Michelle Flournoy was just asked by Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis if she would please become his deputy at the Pentagon. Michelle Flournoy tells Politico.com she said no. She turned down Mattis. She will not become deputy secretary at the Pentagon because she didn't feel like, in good faith, she could join the Trump administration. They're having trouble staffing up in a lot of ways, but for whatever reason, Wilbur Ross tonight got through. that may not end up being a political blessing to this administration, because now Wilbur Ross, with all of his unexplained, mysterious Russia ties, now he is a cabinet secretary. Now he's Secretary of Commerce. And any scandal that ends up affixing to him on this subject will affix to the administration throughout the time that he is in office. And the big problem with Wilbur Ross is that the scandal about him and Russia may ultimately be a scandal about Donald Trump and Russia. And we're going to be joined tonight by David Remnick, the editor of The New Yorker, who has just bylined a mega story on Trump and Putin. Among the news that Remnick has turned up is this. You remember that 35-page dossier with all those salacious details supposedly about Donald Trump? That unconfirmed dossier of dirt that Russians supposedly had on Trump? Well, here's The New Yorker. Quote, the 35-page dossier included claims about Trump's behavior during a 2013 trip to Moscow. The dossier concluded that Russia had personal and financial material on Trump that could be used as blackmail. It said that the Russians had been cultivating, supporting, and assisting Trump for years. According to current and former government officials, prurient details in the dossier generated skepticism among some members of the intelligence community. But in the weeks that followed, they confirmed some of his less explosive claims relating to conversations with foreign nationals. One intelligence official tells the New York Times, quote, they are continuing to chase down stuff from the dossier, and at its core, a lot of it is bearing out. And now here's what is shooting up right now like a flare in the night sky. Quote, some officials believe that one reason the Russians compiled information on Trump during his 2013 trip was that he was meeting with Russian oligarchs who might be stashing money abroad. And that, according to some officials, is why Russia was compiling dirt on Trump. Because he was helping them find places to put their money. Wilbur Ross was confirmed as Commerce Secretary tonight. David Remnick from The New Yorker joins us in just a moment. And I feel like I'm finally starting to understand this.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.